to HLF Anita Nair and Usha Raman. Very happy to welcome back you, Anita. She was with HLF in 2013, and that HLF was held at the Maulana Azad National Urdu University, and she's back with us at HLF, and we are delighted to have her once again at HLF. And in conversation with Anita Nair is a core group member of HLF whom you have already seen and probably know already. Usha Raman teaches media studies at University of Hyderabad. Her writing spans the academic and the popular. It has appeared in the Hindu, Caravan, The Wire, and Sprawl, among others. Recent co-edited books include Feminist Futures of Work, 2023, Childscape, Mediascape, Children and Media in India, 2023, and Digital Expressions of the Selfie, the Social Life of Selfies in India, 2024. Usha also edits a magazine for school teachers called Teacher Plus. She has published a collection of poetry titled All the Spaces in Between, and her debut novel, which we are going to discuss tomorrow, is titled Polite Conversations, which was published in 2024. And Usha's book, Polite Conversation, will be discussed tomorrow in one of the panels. Thank you very much, and over to you, Usha. Once again, as you know the rules of the game, this will be a 50-minute session, and after 40 minutes, it will be opened up for audience questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. And as has been said often at this festival, Anita doesn't really need an introduction. Those of you who are here because you have read her work, have loved her work. In fact, one of my students told me yesterday, and someone repeated that just now, saying that the novel Ladies Coupe changed their lives and changed the way they saw the world. So it's been quite a long journey since Ladies Coupe, which you said 2001, right? And I remember reading that at the time and thinking, that was the first book I had read of Anita's, and I was not a student, I was a much older person, but thinking, this is the kind of work we need to see in Indian literature. This is a voice that we hadn't really come across before, so thanks, Anita, for that. So, of course, we will talk a little bit about your early work, but I'd like to start off by asking you, your work has really spanned multiple genres, right? So, starting with something like Ladies Coupe, then moving on to, where a man was the central protagonist, and then later again, Lessons in Forgetting, and then to move into this new genre, surprising new genre, which is detective crime fiction. So if you could talk a little bit about, what it's taken you to jump genres, and whether making that shift to detective crime fiction from what we might call literary fiction, more mainstream literary fiction, what was that jump like? And I know there are many questions thrown into this, but yes.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and I'm delighted to be back here at the Hyderabad Literary Festival, and thank you for all of you for coming. In my mind, I always saw myself as a literary fiction writer, not because I even knew the term literary fiction when I started writing what was literary fiction, only because I was somebody who felt that there is a lot happening around me and within the minds of a lot of women of my age at that point, and there was absolutely no way to read anything like that at that point. Now, if you looked at literature that came from the UK and the US or any of the English-speaking countries, you would find that there is always engagement where the female writer actually writes about the female condition. But somehow in India, I didn't see that happening in English itself. But that was all like, back of my mind. It really wasn't the reason why I started writing fiction. The reason I started writing fiction was because It is my way of expressing what I am uncomfortable with around the world, and also about celebrating the things that I like in the world. So it began with that, and Ladies Coupe, which is this book that everybody seems to have read at some point or the other, is this book where I actually said that I'm not going to think about what is this form, because the form, it's like a series of short stories that are linked. I'm not going to think about the form. I'm not going to think about how are these characters going to be received. I'm not going to think about any of these things, but write the story that I want to tell, which is the story about 6 women traveling in that ladies' coupe which used to exist and doesn't exist anymore now. So that became my let's say mantra for writing, in the sense that anything that disturbed me, I wanted to write about it. I wanted to, not because I'm looking for a solution, but because I want to understand for myself what is it about that particular topic or particular theme that actually distresses me, and how do we understand it. So if you look at each one of my books, even my crime fiction, that becomes the guiding factor. That there is social commentary woven in without being apparent or in the face, because otherwise then it would end up being a polemic, right? So what I then wanted to do is, Ladies Coupe happened, which was about trying to understand this whole thing. Does a woman need a man or a companion to complete her life? In this case, I mean, I'm not being political. When I wrote this book, I know that in today's world, there would be a whole question of why do you say man? It could be a woman as well. But in 2001, when the book was published, we were still battling this whole thing of, even to this day, about the rampant patriarchal system that we lived in, a world which accepted many things which we don't accept today. So at that point, Ladies Coupe became about that, about questioning many of the things that existed at that point. Then I moved to my next book, Mistress, which was about trying to understand what is artistic success, but woven through the story of a performing artist, a dance form like Kathakali. So one by one, each one of my books became about something that I was trying to understand. Like Lessons in Forgetting was trying to understand female feticide, and the male gaze. How does it work? So for me, in that sense, moving to crime fiction was just a very organic way of taking the social commentary to another level, where you realize that social commentary gives you, let's say, inputs, cues on how to understand the world that we are part of. So that way, the Gowda series was entirely about my engagement with a city and the nature of crime that comes out of that city.
You've actually preempted my next question, which is about the kind of, I understand that social commentary is at the center of what you want to do. So you begin with a problem that kind of nags at you, and then look for a site where that problem can be narrativized, let's say, right? But then in terms of genre, when you're moving from literary fiction, which one could argue requires a certain kind of research, but with crime fiction, and particularly of the detail and the scale at which you have engaged with it, requires a completely different kind of preparation and a different kind of research. And I'm wondering, as I read the books and get into Gowda's life, I'm thinking, how much time, what did you have to read, what did you have to see in order to do these books? So can you talk a little bit about that?
So one of the most exciting things about writing crime fiction was about the kind of research that I had to do. So when I started writing the first book, Cut Like Moon, I had this scene in my head and 2 characters, but I realized that when I put these 2 characters together, how am I going to flesh out the rest of it? I need to know about how is policing done in Karnataka, which is very different from the way it's probably done in Kerala or Tamil Nadu, Telangana, wherever, you know. So I then thought that I need to kind of try and understand a bit more about how policing is done. And because I've lived in Bangalore for a very long time, I have friends in, in various echelons of the government. And I spoke to somebody in the police force and I said, I'd like to be able to meet a few senior policemen and see, and kind of pick their brains and get a few details, etc. So, the city commissioner at that time was very sweet and he called 3 different rungs of cops and said that I would be visiting them and that they would, give me information, etc. So and the first thing that I realized now, since you, in Andhra, Veerappan is not, in Telangana, sorry about that. Veerappan is not such a big name, but for people who live in Karnataka, Veerappan was like this big bandit, he was an elephant poacher, he was a smuggler of ivory and sandalwood, all of that. And the police force had been trying to catch him for several decades, or at least more than a decade. And I go to each one of these cops, and the first thing that they would do is present a big album of photographs, because each of these guys had gone looking for Veerappan at some point. And then what would happen is I would get the same glass of fruity and the same pre-sliced cake at every one of the police stations, and all the answers were sanitized responses to my queries. So at which point I realized that I was getting nowhere with this, and this is something that I could pick off the net or I could get off the newspaper. So then I knew somebody in military police who knew somebody who at that point, a cop who at that point was under long leave, which I think is a euphemism for suspension. So at that point, he said, why don't you meet him, he might speak to you. So we met in a coffee shop. This man was not in his uniform and he opened up. All the questions that I wanted answers for, he opened up. Now, 2 months later, this man was back in his uniform and back at the police station. I go to visit him, I get the same fruity, I get the same cake, and I get the same sanitized responses. So then I had to do something very kind of, cunning, which was basically I would without letting him know, I would just call him. And he wouldn't have time to monitor his responses. So, once in a while he'd let out something. And then I realized that to get actual information, I shouldn't be hanging out with, the senior cops, but I needed to go down. So then I met a couple of sub-inspectors, and I met this brilliant assistant sub-inspector woman who took me to a lot of places, showed me a lot of things. So I think one of the things about researching a crime novel is knowing where to research. Because I asked them if I could see a post-mortem, because I needed to see what is actually done. I couldn't get through. Then finally I knew a doctor who knew somebody, and I managed to sneak into a post-mortem and understand what happens. Because you see, one of the cues about, the most important things about writing is that as a writer, I need to be able to pass on the sensory images that I acquire to my reader. It's only then it comes alive. And how am I going to do that if I don't do on-the-ground research? So research was very, very critical, and is very critical to crime fiction.
Yeah, but again, more on the research in terms of, as a woman, and of course there are many women in India who are writing crime fiction. So it seems to be a genre that is, somewhat blind to gender. But the kind of crime fiction that I'm seeing in your work is, of course, there is plot and the story is important, but the detail, like you said, in terms of how the post-mortem is done, what the inside of the police station is like, what are soft methods of interrogation, all of that for a woman. So do you think gender played a role here, or in either way, in terms of the research? Because you are entering a very patriarchal system. or a masculine system?
No, absolutely, because I felt this disadvantage because it's like when I talk to the male cops, they always think they need to temper down what they tell me, that maybe my gentle female sensibilities will not be able to handle it or whatever. But then I realized that when I talk to the female police women, they are very forthcoming, and they are the ones who would let me know about the gory part of it and stuff like that. But there's also this whole thing of like, even when I want to do, like, let's say a night walk through a certain market, on my own I couldn't do it. I had to have like a couple of male friends go with me and stuff like that. So yes, researching police procedurals are even more difficult than writing regular crime fiction. Especially because it's so detail oriented. You need to have your facts right, because like I said, policing is done differently in different states. And the nature of how they acquire informers, all of that is very different. So I had to be quite shameless. The moment I know that somebody has had to do something to do with the police force, then I'm like constantly badgering them for information and stuff like that, because I know that I may not be able to do it on the ground myself.
Yeah, again, more in terms of the plot and the story, and to go back to your point about social commentary. So if you look at each of the three Inspector Gowda novels, and if you haven't read them, you have to start with one and go to the third, because there is a story in that progression as well. But each of them deals with a very, very deep-rooted social issue, or a couple of them. So in the first one, for instance, and perhaps you can talk about the plot better than I can, but there are two criminal narratives, let's say, and one of them is somewhat resolved, the other one is not quite resolved. So the whole issue of fake currency, for instance, right, and the networks that grow around that. And then there's also a little bit about how transgenders are treated and so on, and the criminalization of certain kinds of behaviors. The second one deals with child sexual trafficking of children, and the third one, which is on stage, looks at a different issue. And I'm just wondering, do you start with a social problem, or do you start with a detective story?
No, I think I start with a social problem. To be very specific, the first one was about a transvestite, what the transvestite goes through. And one of the things that I know, I've lived in Bangalore now for more than 35 years. And I've seen the city change, and I've seen how things change. So once upon a time, the transgenders you saw at the traffic lights were, people who were completely treated like they were like a bad smell, and all of that. Not that much has changed even to this day, but I realized how much they are hated, and I wanted to start writing about what does it feel like to be somebody in that kind of a world. And one of the things that I wouldn't dare to actually write about is to assume a total point of view, because it's not about, I'm afraid of being branded somebody who's doing cultural appropriation. It's not that, or even gender appropriation. It's just basically that I didn't think I knew enough to be able to write about it, but I could write about it to a certain extent. So it began with trying to understand this world. Also, I wanted to introduce Bangalore as a character into the crime novels, because Bangalore has changed so much. So again, like a character, there is a progress of movement in a certain way. I'm not saying progress of movement always has to be in the right direction. Some of it is not working the way it should be. So when I finished the first book, and I knew that, okay, certain things were set in my mind. I have a character called at that point, Inspector Gowda, who, is trying to fight the system. He's tried and he's completely been like, let's say, stamped upon because he's unable to fight the corruption in the system. But when it came to the second book, it became more about the issue itself, and which was about child trafficking. Now, one of the things I discovered when again, why I wrote the book is that there was this newspaper article which gave the details of children missing in a particular year, the number of boys and girls, and how many of them were found. But there was a substantial number of children who were untraceable. And then what happened to these children was the question in my head. I started asking around, and that's when I discovered that at one point, Bangalore was just a transit point for child trafficking, but it had become a hub. And it had become a hub with the growth of the city, so much of construction happening there, immigrant workers from all over the country there. And like a policeman told me himself, they also have their needs. So prostitution became like a big thing and child trafficking became part of it. So it became like I found the issue and then moved on to write about it. Now in the third book, it's really about the real estate itself to some extent and what real estate can cost. But obviously there are other factors also that come into play.
So the third book, which is one of the reasons you're here, starts off with the murder or the homicide of an elderly public intellectual. And of course, you cannot but think about the public intellectuals in Karnataka who have been murdered in gruesome ways, right? So there's an interplay of politics and crime, which again is not unusual. So I haven't finished reading the book yet, but I'm about halfway through, and I'm wondering how important is the political narrative there. I mean, it's the subtext, but in your mind, is that how does that play with the crime, the real estate market?
Yeah, so for me, I think it's now become very difficult for me to separate social commentary, political narrative, and the story angle. The plot itself. So the plot is drawn from both social commentary and a political narrative, which I try to build in because I keep thinking, that I'm somebody who puts a lot of time and energy into my writing in terms of every little detail that goes into it. So I can't really, spend 4 and 5 years of my life writing about something that is not going to make my reader think about the world we inhabit. So it becomes very important for me to be able to build in a political and social commentary while telling a story. So in that sense, I think even my literary fiction over the years has increasingly become political in that sense.
And as we heard this morning with Aruna Roy, I mean, everything is political, right? So the act of writing is political, and every story has its own politics, some more obvious than others. So if I can shift a little bit to the writing itself and the character, the building of character, as opposed to, let's say, Ladies Coupe, where of course you're inhabiting characters who are women and exploring their inner journeys towards independence. Inspector Gowda is, a male character, and I'm just wondering what is that shift like? And of course, it's different writing a male character in a one-off literary novel and staying with a male character over this development. And Inspector Gowda is somebody you're not asking us to like necessarily, because he is a policeman and all of us have, these ideas about people who are in the police. So he's not a perfect person. You wouldn't expect him to be. He has his struggles. So can you talk a little bit about how you develop him? And one associated question is, he's the major character whose interiority we grapple with. The other woman one other woman in the novels is Urmila, who is his girlfriend, who is his lover, and we really don't get to see what she's thinking. So yeah, a little bit about both this.
So Inspector Gowda is this character who, walked into my head fully formed. I knew everything about him. It was almost like meeting somebody I've known all my life, and I realized because that kind of snark that he throws out, the kind of sometimes politically incorrect things he says, is all very reflective of me. So sometimes I always think that Gowda is like my own alter ego in a male form. And I make Gowda do a lot of things that I wish I could do, but I can't. And so, when I wrote the first book, I never intended this to be a series. So when I wrote the first book, halfway through the book, I realized that I liked this character that I'm creating so much. More than like, I just didn't want to let go of him. And it became necessary for me to be able to write a second book, a third book, and hopefully a fourth one, and so on. So the creation of this character was also very linked to the city of Bangalore itself, because Gowda in many ways represents what Bangalore used to be and what Bangalore is turning into, and Gowda is unable to fathom or even live with the idea of what Bangalore has become today. So in that sense, he's also like the city. He's representative of the city itself. And writing this character, I think in many ways was like, very fully formed. See, when I'm writing about a woman, there is a question. In fact, if I were to think about, let's say, a physical aspect of being a woman, it's very easy. I just need to look within my own life or look inwards or look at my own body to understand what happens. But when I'm writing a male character, it's very different, because first thing, I need to stop thinking like a woman. I need to stop feeling like a woman. I need to stop responding like a woman. And I need to completely shed my, my female chromosome and become this male, So it is a question. I always say that for me, writing is very much method writing, because I have to be the character when I'm writing that particular character. When I say I have to be the character in my mind, I have to be the character. So after having spent that kind of energy being this male character, I couldn't let go of him. And I find the same thing happening with every male character I create, that all the books, I think, has to have a second part or a third part, because there's so much of investment of energies into creating that character.
So can you talk a bit about Urmila? I mean, why is it?
Right, yeah. Urmila doesn't get a point of view because crime fiction, one of the things, again, this is not there's no hard and fast rule, but the way I see it, this book is entirely from Gowda's point of view. So Urmila is very important to him, but, or let's say Urmila is significant to him, but she's not important to him. So that's the thing, and so that's the point of view that she gets. She gets the point of view of the significant person, but she's not important enough to have a point of view that is independent of Gowda.
Which is, again, as how do you then separate your feminist self from the writing of Gowda? Because Gowda is, you can hear him thinking about, what Urmila might say. Because Urmila, for those of you who haven't read the book, is definitely a feminist. But it's a strange relationship, right? She accepts the fact that she is not part of his, his main life, so to speak. And so I'm just wondering how do you navigate that for yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, so let me tell you, you finish the third book, you'll realize why Urmila is probably somebody who, despite the book 1 and 2, book 1 is all this romance, they're meeting this, college sweethearts, they meet after a long time and suddenly they both are in difficult marriages and they kind of like, both are attracted to each other, because it's also that age. If you look at it, a lot of people in their late 40s and early 50s suddenly kind of feel that they need to rekindle school, romances and college romances. It happens all the time. So I was also kind of playing into that thing that was happening. All the school reunions and college reunions, and then people kind of disappear into the sunset. leaving their families behind and stuff like that. So it began. The first book is about this beautiful romance they have with all the ups and downs and all that. In the second book, she becomes a much more solid part of the investigation itself. But by the third book, you see that the feminist in me, you were saying, how do I reconcile that? In the third book, you see this feminist part of me rearing its head, and where Urmila is no longer going to take what Borigauda dishes out to her.
Yeah, so I look forward to learning about that. So you already talked a little bit about the city and the city becoming such an important part of the narrative, and that's something you see very clearly, right? And in the three books, you actually traverse the city, both the older parts as well as the emerging newer parts. But I think all three books are set in 2012 and 2013, and in this decade since then, there's been again, maybe not in terms of the texture, but definitely in terms of the scale of the change. There's been a huge shift. So would you want to set your next Borigauda novel in the same period, or do you think you would move ahead in time?
Not too much, because one of the things that I need to worry about is Gauda's retirement age. So if I were to set it too far ahead into the future, then he would be out of service by that time, which means the complete layering of the story would be very different. And also, back of my mind, so I wrote the first book in 2011. So, which is why the first book is set in 2011, and the second book is set in the early part of 2012, and the third book is in the last part of 2012, moving into 2013. So I really can't do too much into the future because of Gauda's retirement age. And the other thing, of course, is also that the city went through this drastic change, I think, in the time between 2010 to 2014. After that, what has really happened is that we have a lot of problems because of a city that has become has grown outside its own expected size. So the city is kind of like there's a population explosion, there's a vehicle explosion, all of that. So the changes that have come are actually more cosmetic rather than internal.
Yeah. So in terms of the city and Gauda, obviously, he's somebody who seems to learn very quickly. He takes on new, he's open to new kinds of technologies, even though he still finds it difficult to text. And I'm wondering how you bring your sensibility of the present and kind of take it back to a pre-smartphone era almost. So which is a detail, but what role does technology play in the books?
So it's like, in let's say from 2010 onwards, where everybody was having a phone of some sort, but the smartphones were still kind of like, not in everybody's hands, or they didn't know what to do with it, and social media was not bursting with as much activity as it is now, that I wanted to kind of work Gauda into this whole technological change with the way that a normal person would, not this tech-savvy person or whatever, but somebody who has to grow up with this new technology that is part of new policing methods. So, to that extent, I know people wonder if I'm like, a technical klutz, which I'm not. I take great pride in saying this because I can figure out most things. But the thing is, most people aren't, of a certain generation aren't. Most of us are technical klutzes in one way or the other, especially if you're, into your 50s and stuff like that. So how comfortable you are with, unless of course you come from a tech background, but a person, let's say a school teacher or a bank clerk or a veterinary doctor, doesn't matter, all of them are not technically savvy, and I wanted Gauda to be part of that. So which is why I worked in this thing.
So for those of you who have not encountered Gowda, I was wondering if Anita could read a little bit that introduces us to him. And then we'll open it up for questions.
I'm just going to read a tiny section for you, just to give you an introduction to Gowda. Gowda dragged his suitcase into the bedroom. Everything looked ship-shape within the house. The newspapers had been placed neatly on the coffee table, and the surfaces gleamed dust-free. His eyes widened in surprise. Shanti, his maid, wasn't given to tidying frenzies. It was only when he would pointedly run a finger on a grimy surface that she flicked a duster with a snort. I just dusted yesterday. I can't help the construction work and dust settling on everything here. Earlier, when he had dropped his suitcase inside the door on his way to Professor Madhud's house, he had noticed with delight that both his bike and car were sparkling clean. It was unusual for Shanti to clean the vehicles without a reminder. Something was afoot, he had thought then, and now he was certain. He placed the suitcase near his bed and went into the kitchen. The fridge had bottles of water and his lunch in an assortment of Tupperware dishes. On the dining table was a jar that held half a dozen rava laddus and another jar filled to the brim with Congress kadlikai. That's the name of fried peanuts in Bangalore. Gowda unscrewed the jar and shook a few of the masala peanuts into his mouth. When he had munched through them, he took out a rava laddu and popped it whole into his mouth. He hoped that she wasn't going to ask for a week off or a sizable loan.
Okay, so immediately you're able to identify with the human side of this person. So I have one last question for you, Anita, before we open it up to the audience, which is, your books have been translated to other media as well. And as somebody who's primarily a writer of books, how do you feel about that? So I, for instance, when I was reading your books, a couple of them I listened to as audiobooks, and there was a bit of a jarring sensation in terms of the accent and so on. So how do you react to your books being produced in other media, whether it is film or audiobooks?
So one of the things that I did recently, a couple of years ago, was work on commissioned audio stories. Because the writing is very different. When you're writing for film, it's very different. When you're writing for audio, it's different. And when you're writing for it to be read, it's very different. So some of the, I agree with you, some of the audiobooks, audio renditions of my books are not exactly what I would like to hear, because there is that kind of mismatch between accents and the places that I'm writing about. But with the audio stories, I enjoyed it because it was, Indians who were reading it. And one of the actors I like immensely is this actor called Prakash Raj. And so much so, when I was working on Gowda, after like about quarter way through the book, I was like, if there was an actor who was to play Gowda, it has to be Prakash Raj. It can't be anybody else. And over the years, we met and we became very good friends. And two of my books, audio stories, were read by Prakash. And what he brought to the reading, I realized, was so different from what just a reader reading it out. So I think now it's for me important that I know who's going to be reading it and that it has to be an Indian.
Okay, so thanks. I can ask you many more questions, but I think there are people in the audience who have read your work and who have liked your work, so I will allow them to have their turn. Yes, I see a hand back there. Are the volunteers around? Hello? Don't see any. They're over there. We need volunteers to take mics around. There was was a hand here. Hello Anita, this is Lata here. First book of yours that I read was Idris the Keeper, and I loved the book. And today I am so disappointed that the book is not even mentioned in your list of books on Google. I want to know what was your motivation in writing that book, the inspiration in fact.
So Idris is actually my, let's say, foray into historical fiction, which in terms of research is even more daunting than writing a police procedural, because I'm writing about Kerala, where there were most of the, the record keeping was done on palm leaf. So it wasn't ever preserved, and all that is left in terms of historical, let's say, information is what is available on copper plates and ledgers, statements of accounts. So in that sense, Idris was this book that I put my heart and soul into, and it's still the book that I think there will, at one point, I still want to write a sequel to it. Not a sequel, it's actually meant to be a trilogy, because it actually talks about a particular custom or a particular tradition that happened in Kerala in up to the 17th century, which was like a kingship ritual that they had. And all of that I wanted to capture and write about Kerala of that period, because there's very little known about it. Now, if you were to look at the Deccan Sultanate, or if you were to look at the Mughals, or if you look at all the dynasties before them, there is enough of information available. But here there is mostly foreign traveler accounts, and none of these foreign travelers knew Malayalam. So it was mostly what the interpreter told them and stuff. It was wonderful trying to piece information together and create this character and talk about 17th century Kerala. So for me, the motivation was to actually, keeper of light. I wanted to be the keeper of records of that time. It's a book that requires a certain amount of engagement from the reader. It's not for the lazy reader. So I guess that's why it is not probably as popular as some of my other books are.
Any other questions?
Hi ma'am, I have read as of now only one book, but I was really fascinated and bored by the book. It is Ladies Book, and I was really mesmerized how you have provided the ending and how in the setting of the book from which the point starts and the way it ends is very novel and very fascinating. So how do you frame your conclusion while writing? B, another question which I have, how do you see a woman, because you have selected these Indian women in their domestic space, right? So how do you see the progression? It's very revolutionary, at the same time very challenging to the said patriarchy which is still existing. So how do you see your acceptance as an author when you write such narrative, and what is your motivation? How do you see your progression in terms of growth?
Okay, several questions there. I'll start off by saying that I don't actually plan the ending of my book. In a vague way, I know what is going to happen. But sometimes the writing itself, the writing is so organic that as you come towards the end of the book, the ending that I may have planned on is not the ending that it may actually end as. The conclusion might be very different, because your characters become three-dimensional as you are writing them. In the beginning, when I start, they are still like hazy in my mind, but after a while they become flesh and blood to me. So then when they become flesh and blood people, then they have to react as flesh and blood people, not in this very idealistic way that I probably saw them. So that is one part of it. So the conclusion, it was very organic in that sense, because Ladies Coupe is set in a train that starts at Bangalore and reaches Kanyakumari. At the end of Kanyakumari, there is nothing. in terms of geographically, figuratively, and literally, there's nothing there. So this woman has to make a decision at some point. So that is why the ending ends like that. Okay? She has to take a call on who she is, because there's no further for her to go. That's answering the first question. Second question, if I remember you asking me, what does it feel as a woman to write these characters? So when like I said earlier, when I started off, I was writing about what I knew and what I was familiar with, which is basically, the domestic space. I'm saying even when a woman has a career, she still has to, rule the domestic space, or at least not rule but control the domestic space to some extent, right? It's the part of her life. And I realized that I wrote another book which maybe you should try reading. It's called Eating Wasps, and it's set in 2018. So if, let's say, Ladies Coupe was set in 1997 or 1996, it's almost 20 years after. And you realize that many things have changed, but nothing has really changed. So again, it's a story of 10 women of all ages and sizes and everything. Each story is different, but they're all connected because they're living they are connected through a certain device that I use in it. And it's built on the life of based on the life of a Malayalam writer who killed herself in 1965. She was the youngest Sahitya Academy Award winner, and she was about 32 or in her early 30s. And she killed herself, and to this day, nobody knows why she killed herself. So I use that as a pointer to look at lives thereafter. And so in 2018, when you have the story set, we're talking about what social media can do to a woman. When you have slut shaming happening, or when you see when a woman gets onto a dating app and then she has a stalker. So what happens thereafter? So I have changed in many ways. I think the narrative is the same, but the conditions are very different. But the way women respond don't really change. So in that sense, I was doing this kind of reconnaissance of Ladies Coupe with Eating Wasps. So you see the transformation in that sense. I think I've answered your questions.
Just one more question.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to listen to what you had to say from your experience. I have actually two questions. So you have been talking about looking at the social issues and trying to use them as your plots. Do you think of a solution or an ideal solution and you try to express that from your characters? Okay. So how does that go? I think you kind of answered that in your previous answer. You don't think of the ending and you go forward, but I want to listen to a little bit more on that. And the second question I have is, did you ever have to deal with a writer's block? And if yes, how did you get over that?
Okay, I'll start with the second question. No, not yet. Until now, I've not had writer's block. But that's because I follow certain things which, I think you can get, you pull yourself out of your writer's block if you have that, which is basically trying to, I mentor writers and I tell them to follow these things when they enter block, which is basically that, try and have a designated writing space, etc. So after a while, we are creatures of habit, the Pavlovian response will kick in. And you will sit there and you will feel like, you need to, or you feel guilty about it. So you might not do it in a week's time, but in 10 days' time, you'll start writing again. And few things, get out of whatever you're doing and put it aside. If the writing is not happening, put it aside. Don't stress about it. It'll come back to you. When the story is ready to be told, it'll come back to you. Now, the first question that you asked, see, as every other person in this room, none of us have solutions to all the problems. But what we could do is examine these problems to see how do we deal with it, right? So, to give you like a very, very definite example, after I wrote Ladies Coupe, and this book was like doing marvelously well everywhere, in every part of the world. So it wasn't like a flash in the pan kind of thing. And I was being told that, oh yes, this is like the holy grail of all books because it's literary and it's also selling and all those things. And yes, and back of my mind as a writer, as an artist, I was asking myself, did I really write such a good book? Why is it that people think it's a good book? That made me question, what is artistic success? What is artistic success? Is it something that I know for myself when I do it, I feel the sense of accomplishment, that I've raised the bar for myself? Or is artistic success that I think I have because the world tells me that I've written a good book? I need to understand what is artistic success. So that is the point when I realized that I do not have solutions. But what I can do is do an honest exploration of it and put it out there so every other person who is questioning themselves about many of these things that I write about can have a point of view or a perspective on how to look at that problem. Yeah. So that's what I do with each one of my books.
Thank you. Thanks, Anita. And I think with that, we're completely out of time. But thank you so much for talking to us, and thank you all for being a great audience.
Thank you. Thank you, Usha.
Thank you very much, Anita Nair and Usha Raman. Thank you for coming to HLF. And ladies and gentlemen, Anita Nair's book, Hot Stage, is available at the bookshop. Grab a copy, and Anita Nair. And without even asking her, I said, she would be happy to sign books. There's a copy